war changes everything. From 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War changed our country for all time, in ways you may not have even thought about.
You know, the Civil War was bloody and costly. But the story of this war doesn't begin and end on the battlefields. These stories also occurred in homes, farms, and towns. And the soldiers weren't the only heroes. Hi, I'm Adrian. And for the next few minutes, we're going to take a look at the heroes who didn't just wear blue and gray. These were hidden heroes. Heroes with their own special kind of courage. Courage that was shown on and around the ground where I'm standing right now, where there was a battle that changed the war, that changed America. This is a place for heroes. This is Fort Donelson.
Our country exploded into civil war in April of 1861. 11 southern states said they were canceling their membership in the U.S., and they were starting their own country called the Confederate States of America. The United States said no way. I'll tell you more about that in a minute.
But for now, chances are a lot of you haven't even heard of Fort Donelson, or even the battle that took place here in February of 1862. This fort along the Cumberland River and Fort Henry on the nearby Tennessee River were built by the Confederate Army. But why build forts on rivers?
When America split into the Union and Confederate states, state lines became battle lines, and waterways became gateways. The Cumberland and Tennessee rivers ran into the heartland of Tennessee, providing a route to reach the lower southern states. Forts Donelson, Henry, and Heiman were built to close the gates on those rivers. You know how you can jump on an interstate now and pretty much go wherever you want? Well, that's how rivers were then. Rivers like the Cumberland were used for travel and shipping goods. But during the war, rivers were also an easy way for the Union Army of the North to invade the South.
And that's why the Confederates chose to build Fort Donelson here. Any Union boats coming up the Cumberland River were going to get blasted. The clock was ticking for a big showdown at Fort Donelson, but lives were being changed all over the place.
At homes everywhere, women's lives were turned upside down. The men were going to war, and the women were left in charge of the house, the children, everything. And there were the slaves, African Americans. They were about to get the chance to break their chains, and that would take courage. The soldiers. Most of them were just regular people like us, some even around our age. But they left their homes and joined the fight to save their own different countries, the United States and the Confederate States of America. And that tells us heroes are made, not born.
Real heroes come from hard times, and you can't get much harder than war. So how did we ever get to the point that war looks like the only way?
The North and South were already splitting because of differences in people's lifestyles. See, the North had larger cities with more people, a strong educational system, and factories to keep its economy moving. While the South also had some major cities, most of the land was countryside, smaller towns and farms, and an economy built on agriculture. And that last part was tied to what was probably the biggest split of all: slavery.
And so by 1860, the southern states have nearly 4 million slaves. And they are a vital part of the economy. And the South is not willing, those who own slaves in the South, who are only 20% of the whites in the South own slaves, are not willing to give up those slaves because they are a part of the wealth of the economy.
Imagine knowing you would be a slave for the rest of your life. A lot of African Americans heroically risked their lives to change that future. Most took that risk on their own, while others followed a loosely, yet more organized path to freedom that became known as the Underground Railroad. Freedom seekers looked for refuge wherever they could find it. Those destinations of freedom extended throughout the United States, into the Western Territories and Canada, even Mexico and the Caribbean. And many times the direction in which that path headed was north.
You probably know that by 1861, a lot of people in the North were against slavery. But what you probably don't know is that the northern states, for a time, also supported slavery. But their economy got to a point that they didn't depend on slave labor anymore. Along with that, some people in the North began to feel the enslavement of African Americans was just wrong. So one by one, the northern states abolished slavery. These northern states also wanted to keep slavery from spreading to other states. The North and South didn't see eye to eye on much of anything, so war was only a matter of time.
To beat the Confederates, the Union Army would have to get control of the Cumberland and other rivers. And to do that, they would have to get rid of Fort Donelson and other river forts. In the North, General Ulysses S. Grant and Admiral Andrew Foote put Plan A into action. By February 13, 1862, thousands of Union soldiers had made the trip south, defeated the Confederates at Fort Henry, and were on their way to Fort Donelson. Grant would attack the fort by both land and river. One thing that made this such a radical plan were the Union gunboats. Most of them were ships called ironclads, a metal-plated floating fort that was hard to beat.
You know, sometimes the Civil War feels too long ago to really matter, kind of buried in dust and cobwebs. But right now, I'm inside an actual Union ironclad gunboat, identical to the ones used at Forts Henry and Donelson. Almost 150 years ago, this gunboat was cruising rivers and attacking Confederate forts. That is, until it was sunk by the enemy. And now, after almost 100 years on the river bottom, the Cairo was raised and restored. Now I can stand in front of the same ironclad where men fought for their lives and for a cause they believed in. It's a weird feeling, but it's one that lets us know history isn't a fairy tale. It's about real things happening to real people. Fire!
And the reality of war hit home on February 14th, Valentine's Day. But nobody was thinking about love, candy, or flowers. The Union gunboats, similar to the Cairo, started the attack. But the ironclads couldn't do the job as everyone thought. The Confederates pounded the boats, killing several men. The gunboats retreated. On February 15th, the Confederates made a surprise sunrise attack on the Union lines. The Northern troops pushed back hard. At the end of the day, the Confederates were back where they started, trapped inside the fort.
It was a cold night for the soldiers inside Fort Donelson, and an unhappy one for the Confederate command. But some hard calls had to be made.
Commander of the fort, General John Floyd, met with his second and third in command, General Gideon Pillow and General Simon Buckner, at a hotel in Dover. The decision was made to surrender Fort Donelson.
On February 16, 1862, General Grant accepted the unconditional surrender of Fort Donelson here at the Dover Hotel. Now, the Cumberland River and thousands of miles of land were open to the Union Army. Fort Donelson is the site of a battle that changed a lot of things. Not just for the soldiers, but also for their families back home.
I will. I'll come back and I'll ride as much as I can, okay?
Please come back.
All right.
Hey, Mother, please.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
All across America, thousands of men left their homes to go to war. And thousands of women suddenly found themselves taking on new roles. Women became the only parent in the absence of their husbands. The hard work that used to be shared was now hers to do alone. Another responsibility was protecting the home. It was a job that took courage. Supporting their men, Southern women would sometimes make uniforms for the Confederate soldiers. And when the Union Army and fighting came too close, some Southern women chose to leave their homes for a life of safety somewhere else.
For the women in the northern states, things weren't any easier. All of their soldiers were being sent deep into southern lands, which today is like a soldier going overseas into hostile foreign territory. So these women had a different kind of heroism. If the war wasn't coming to them, they were going to the war.
Mary Bickerdike left her Illinois home to help the Union wounded. She stayed on as a nurse, even though she had no actual experience. Earning the respect of General Grant, Mary Bickerdike traveled with the Army, arriving at Fort Donelson. During the evening of February 15, 1862, following the bloodiest day of the battle, Bickerdike walked the battleground. On that winter night, many of the wounded were freezing to death. Bickerdike brought them food and water and hope. It was an act she would repeat on 19 battlefields before the end of the war. And to the people who dared ask who gave her the authority to do things her own way, she had an answer.
I do this on the authority of Lord God Almighty. Have you anything that outranks that?
Another woman chose to leave the safety of her northern home to be at her husband's side. Mary Ann Newcomb followed the Union Army until the last days of the war, even after her husband was killed. She devoted herself to helping the wounded at many battles, including Fort Donelson.
As I walked over the battlefield in search of loved ones and saw the terrible work war had made, I felt to say in my heart, "Oh God, how long must we suffer?"
No doubt about it. Americans were suffering. But there was another group of Americans suffering long before the war began. Slaves were worked hard. They weren't allowed to be educated. They couldn't even go where they wanted. They had no rights. Just imagine living like that. No wonder most of them saw the Civil War as a way out.
African-American slaves across the state of Tennessee, and indeed across the South, realized that the coming of the Union Army meant freedom for them.
Escape was one of the many ways enslaved African Americans fought against their chains. That escape might be through the Underground Railroad, or by other means. But when Fort Donelson fell into Union hands, freedom-seeking slaves now had a safe place in a southern state. Along with freedom, many African Americans also found something else at Fort Donelson: dignity.
Thank you, sir.
20,133 blacks will serve in the Union Army in Tennessee. Their name is USCT, meaning United States Colored Troops, as they are called. And they will serve in all the major battles. They will guard the railroads and the bridges throughout Tennessee. They will be very prominent in the Battle of Nashville, December 1864.
One, two.
Fort Donelson became a recruiting and training center for African American troops. Now these heroes could put on a uniform and become soldiers.
But Fort Donelson was like a magnet, because along with the freedom-seeking slaves who joined the United States colored troops came friends and family. Lots of friends and family. The Union Army just wasn't set up to deal with that.
Okay.
So the Freedom's Aid Association was born. White teachers and missionaries from the North were sent to Fort Donelson and towns around it. These people helped former slaves start their own lives, and also brought the gift of education.
Or the other way. Start over here.
Of course, there were heroes in more likely places, too.
For some Fort Donelson soldiers, these log huts were luxury hotels. It was either this, a flimsy tent, or being out in the open winter air. For the common soldier, war was miserable, even without someone shooting at you.
One of the 15,000 to 17,000 Confederate soldiers inside Fort Donelson was keeping a diary. His name was Spot F. Terrell.
The cold north wind was blowing and cutting our ears and fingers. We suffered a great deal from the severe cold and snow that lay spread over the ground.
But it was what happened on the battlefield of Fort Donelson that could turn an average soldier into a hero. Voltaire P. Twombly was one of those heroes. Still a teenager, Twombly was a Union soldier at Fort Donelson. He was one of the color guard responsible for carrying the American flag into battle.
During a Union attack on the fort, Twombly had the chance to show his courage. An eyewitness tells us what happened after 3 soldiers carrying the flag were killed or wounded.
The colors were then taken by Corporal Twombly, who was almost instantly knocked down by a bullet. He immediately rose and bore the colors gallantly to the end of the fight. Not a single man of the color guard, but Twombly, was on his feet at the close of the engagement.
Twombly lived, and in 1897, 35 years later, he received the Medal of Honor for his actions.
I get to see you again. The war has taken a sad turn these last few weeks with the fall of Donelson and then Nashville.
Bravery like that was common at Fort Donelson, but not as common as something all soldiers experience, even today: homesickness. Soldiers stationed far away need to know that someone back home cares.
I can write many things to you, but if I could see you, I could tell you more in 1 minute than I can write in a week.
In just a few weeks after the battle at Fort Donelson, the Union Army would occupy Nashville, the first Confederate capital city to be lost. It would take 3 more years for the defeat of the Confederacy and the end of the war. Ordinary women met the challenge of war by supporting their soldiers, running the home, and even protecting it. At the same time, heroes like Mary Bickerdike and Mary Newcomb put their home lives on hold to help others. The battle at Fort Donelson and the Civil War gave enslaved African Americans a way to declare their right to be respected and educated. It would be a long road for them, and for a reunited America. There would be rebuilding and repair. A lot would have to be done to leave the anger and hate in the past, but there are some things that should never be forgotten.
As we move toward each new generation, the Civil War fades and fades and fades into the past. It was Frederick Douglass who said that we should never forget the Civil War, and that the memory and the history of that war should be preserved so that we can learn the bad and the evil as well as the good that came out of that particular war.
Here at Fort Donelson National Cemetery near Dover, Tennessee, 670 Civil War soldiers are buried. Of that number, 512 are unknown. No names for the heroes who gave their lives. When the men and women like those we've met remain unknown, we all lose something. But when we learn about them, talk about them, keep them alive, it really pays off. Because we can't know where we're going if we don't know where we came from. Thanks for listening. And thanks for visiting a place for heroes called Fort Donelson.